while we see so much destruction within the landscape, that is exactly the place where healing can occur. And that's where we can bring about the rehabilitation required.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, a podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. This one is a conversation with Alexandra Steed.
So my name's Alexandra Steed. I'm a landscape architect and urban designer.
She is also the author of the new book, Portrait to Landscape, a landscape strategy to reframe our future. And that's really the topic of today's episode. We talk about why she wrote the book, what are some of the core messages within it, and then we go really wide-ranging conversation all the way through sort of philosophy and ethics around landscapes and our connection to landscapes, all the way through to talking about systems changes, and even to the minutiae of what can you do on your next project to really bring nature to the forefront, even to the point of how you're specifying tree pits or not using pits at all. So I think it's a really good conversation. I think for lots of people, and I think lots of people will get something out of this. We also talk about restoring landscapes on a large scale and how we can build not only biodiversity but also climate resilience by doing that. We talk about bringing nature back within cities and reflect on the UK's Environment Act and how that and biodiversity net gain are working in reality. And also throughout, Alexandra shares quite a lot of case studies of real projects so you can make these concepts very tangible. So that is good. And we also just share some book recommendations as well, which I know some of you are probably into. So yeah, that's it for me. Enjoy this chat. Last thing I'll say is, if you are enjoying the podcast, you can always support it financially by giving a donation once off or monthly. And the link to do that is in the episode description. That really helps to keep it up and running and pay for all the running costs. And the other thing you can do is join the Green Urbanist Weekly newsletter. It's called the Green Urbanist Weekly because once upon a time I did post emails on a weekly basis. We're no longer in that reality anymore, unfortunately, but I am going to get back into posting regularly again at some point soon. So sign up and you'll get some updates and you get some more content and that kind of thing, all about green urbanism. What's not to love? Okay, enjoy the episode. Thanks, guys. One of the reasons we wanted to chat today was about a book that you've just written and it is out now. Just tell us about it. Tell us about why did you write it? What's the story behind it? All that stuff.
Right. Well, the book is called Portrait to Landscape, a landscape strategy to reframe our future. And I really felt a sense of urgency in writing this book, actually. As we look around and we see the state of the environment globally, with ecological decline, global warming, climate change, polar ice melt, severe storms, floods, weather events that are happening kind of more and more. They're accelerating, they're becoming more extreme. And people's lives are really becoming terribly affected by this around the world. And I thought, I need to do something about this, and there's urgency. The UN has said, this is the decade of action. We really must make change within this decade before 2030 to turn things around before it's too late. And so I thought, well, what can I do? As a landscape architect, I have certain expertise and certain knowledge about how we can go about restoring the planet in certain ways. And I wanted the world to know, not only landscape architects and not only people within sort of the built environment industries, but also just the world to know that there is hope and there is something that we can do to change our situation on this planet and to learn to live in a way with integrity to inhabit the planet in a different way than we are currently. So I wanted to kind of spread the word and to let people know that, while we see so much destruction within the landscape, that is exactly the place where healing can occur. And that's where we can bring about the rehabilitation required. So, so I was really inspired to kind of get the word out, just to be another voice that is sharing hope and a different view of things. And so, I chose the title Portrait to Landscape because I really felt that there was, a very radical shift that needs to happen, a critical sort of reorientation of our perspective, to broaden out our field of interest and our field of stewardship. So for example, portrait to landscape, you might think of that in terms of a frame, a portrait frame that is just looking at ourselves, really, just at a human portrait, and then turning it to a landscape orientation that's looking at that whole sort of living community around us. And then also, I think it resonated with me, this idea of portrait to landscape, because our world now is so obsessed with taking selfies. So it's this idea of we're all so focused on ourselves, constantly having the frame focused at ourself, and sometimes just completely oblivious to what's going on around us. So that was another idea, that we turn then the gaze from ourselves outwards to this glorious community around us, and really kind of embracing that. So that's what I wanted to do in this book, is to show how we can change our perspective from portrait to landscape. So we can talk a little bit more about that.
Amazing.
Well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. And I think it's really like, were you influenced by Donella Meadows in your sort of framing of this?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, that's really interesting, because there's something that has come up on the podcast again and again and again. And I was just talking to someone yesterday about it, was the systems thinker Donella Meadows, who wrote the book Thinking in Systems. And she has a really influential essay where she talks about the different leverage points that you can interact with a system to try and shift it into another state. And the top leverage point that she's identified is the worldview and the way that we actually, inhabit the world and look at systems. And so a lot of people come at it from that perspective, where they say, right, we need to change our mindsets, that kind of thing. So it's interesting that you came to that conclusion from a different direction.
I know, it's really interesting. And actually, like, since writing the book, I've also come across Ian McGilchrist, who, I don't know if you know of his work, but again, it's talking about changing this worldview. And he talks about the hemispheres of the brain, and how because one has become sort of over prioritized, then that we don't have that sort of more comprehensive and holistic worldview. So anyway, I think the more and more I think about this topic, you realize there's so many people talking about similar things. And actually, I think people have been thinking about similar things for years and years too. Because one of the books that I found most interesting and helpful when I was going through my own process of writing a book was a book of letters by Einstein. And I just had it sitting on my shelf, and it was kind of one of those things that I never really read, but I happened to pick it up and be just kind of flipping through the pages while I was working on my own book. And I came across this quote that I'll read to you right now, because I love it so much. And it really helped me kind of bring all of my ideas together in one succinct way. And he did it for me, decades before. So I'll just read this quote for you. A human being is a part of a whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So
Wow.
when I read that, I thought, wow, that really brings together and encapsulates so beautifully kind of all of these things I've been thinking about, about changing our perspective about how we go about doing that by considering ourselves as not separate and learning that we are part of nature, relearning that, because I think that's just something we've
Yeah.
forgotten. Um, and then how do we do that? Well, we do that by embracing all of nature. And so that's what my book kind of sets out as you go through it, is kind of the current condition, um, how we got to that point, then how we must turn our worldview and how we can go about doing that. So anyway, so that quote was just a real catalyst for me. And another person to mention is Aldo Leopold,
Yeah. Yeah.
that I know you're fond of too. And he was so inspirational to me as well through his text and his land ethic. Again, this is something that was written as like probably almost a century ago now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's still so relevant and forward thinking and progressive, what he was writing at that time. So he talked about how, in our world, we have ethics that guide us as individuals, according to Western philosophy and religion, for example. So we might have the golden rule and about how we relate to each other, but we don't really have any kind of ethic that guides us in how we deal with the rest of the living community. That's been ignored, really. And so we've gone about doing things in a way that is, very dominant and conquering and destructive when it comes to dealing with the rest of the living world and asserting our dominance. So, his work is just incredible in terms of how we can reposition ourselves as just one member of this much larger and beautiful living community. And then how we respect all those other residents of the planet.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that's great, and I like that you've sort of made it clear that, in a sense, none of this is really new, and we've been talking about it for a long time. And I'm always fascinated and I suppose very touched by Indigenous perspectives on our connection to nature. And like a small example of that is reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she talks about the honorable harvest, where if you're out foraging or gathering materials, if you're looking for a particular plant, you don't take the first one you find, because that might be the last one. And when you do find enough, you don't take more than half. And then there's also an aspect of sort of giving something back to the earth when you take something away. So I think she talks about, dropping some tobacco in the place where you've harvested, that particular plant. And I think for some people that might seem like a bit, sort of a bit unsophisticated, but actually the ecological principles that are embedded within that around not, ensuring you're not over harvesting anything to the point that it can't reproduce itself. And the fact that you're adding nutrients back into the soil when you're taking something away. So there's remaining a balance there. There's thousands of years of wisdom there that we need to relearn, from these communities.
Exactly. I think that's an excellent point. I've not yet read her book, but it's on my list. It's on my list of things to read, because I've heard it's very beautiful.
It is. It's well worth it for sure. It's quite long, but it's very it's written in a very nice prose. So yeah, it's definitely one to sit down with a cup of tea with.
and that notion of giving back is so important, because everything, when you think about the way industrial agriculture has gone over the last 50 years or so, and it's just all about kind of overproduction. How can we get this soil to produce more and more food? And, so pouring fertilizers in and using loads of pesticides and having monocultures. And it's all about extraction and of driving the earth to produce more and more, when in fact we need to be giving back, and we need to be sort of investing in the land and ensuring its health, rather than just constant pressures on it. So I think that whole principle, just even even if it's only conceptual, just, the notion of dropping tobacco or something like that, even if it is only conceptual, I think it really keeps kind of at the front of the mind, the importance of giving back to the earth and how we must invest and always be careful about what we're taking and giving back, just the way you would in a human relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it wouldn't be a very good relationship if you're always the one taking from someone. Have to reciprocate.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of narcissistic approach to life, isn't it? The way that our society, or the way, Western societies in general and beyond that have approached our relationship to nature. It's extremely narcissistic. So
in terms of your book, are you writing aimed at built environment professionals, or you think this be for a wider audience as well?
Yeah, I wanted it to be for a wider audience. So while it is for built environment professionals, it's also meant to be for everybody, because I do believe that, well, for one, a lot of people are interested. There's so many people interested in environment, and there's so many people concerned by what's going on currently on the planet. So there's loads of people that are interested in ideas that can help us reshape things and transform our world. So yeah, there's ideas in this book for everybody. And it looks at kind of a top-down to ground-up approach to how we can go about restoring the earth. Should I outline maybe a little bit of that?
Yeah, go for
strategy?
It. Please do.
Okay, so so I wrote the book in 4 major parts. And actually, when I was going about the process of starting to write the book, I was like, oh man, I've never written a book before. How do I even go about this process? I didn't really have a clue where to begin. And, I've done a lot of writing in my career, but never a book. So I thought, okay, well, what I do know how to write is a landscape strategy. So let's start with that. And I can use that kind of format where I lay out the vision, and then I move into the assessment and kind of looking at the existing conditions, then setting out the design principles, and then moving into sort of the key moves and your design proposal. So I thought, okay, well, let's try and structure it like that. So that's what I did. And it really helped me kind of get my head around pulling all these ideas together. And so the first is called vision. The first part is called vision. And I actually use Einstein's quote there to set out kind of 3 main elements of that vision. So acknowledging that our global issues stem from this delusion of separateness that he outlines, this optical delusion of separateness. And then the importance of liberating ourselves from that delusion of separateness. And then to do that our task, and, he even says our task must be, so he sets out this task to widen our circle of compassion to all of nature. So that's kind of the vision that I use to think about the shift in perspective and this way that we can integrate our way of thinking to deal with a much broader living community to go about healing the earth. And then the second part of the strategy is looking at the big picture. So here I really delve into, okay, well, what's the current state of things? What's the state of the environment? What does the scientific community have to tell us about this? How bad is it? What are the planetary boundaries that we're looking at? I don't know if you're familiar with Johann Rockström and his 9 planetary boundaries, but they're extremely helpful too to kind of get an indication of where we are and how urgent things are globally. So I look at that, and then looking at, well, how did we even get to this place? What is it about humanity that has caused us to go down this certain path? How did we get here? And so I kind of lay out, it's a huge topic in itself that could easily be books, so, or more. Anyway, so I just try and do that kind of briefly, thinking about Western philosophy, scientific ideas, how religion has worked into that, and kind of then set us up to think of ourselves as dominant and superior over other life forms, that sort of thing. And that in itself has caused all sorts of issues. So anyway, and then at the end of that, kind of look at the bigger picture, I did want to kind of, it can be really overwhelming and very gloomy. So I did want us to remember that the biosphere is an amazing sort of unified organism that actually has capacity for self-renewal if only we allow it to be able to take care of itself. But at the moment, because we're just dumping so much, garbage, so much rubbish and toxins and pollution that it's just become oversaturated with this horrible stuff. So we need to step back and just allow the biosphere to heal itself. So I talk about that, and then I move into the third section about defining landscape. And here is where I talk about, well, what actually is landscape? And, the fact that it's always transforming and shifting, and it can be reshaped. And that's one of the most beautiful elements about landscape, is this element of change. So, there's so much possibility in landscape. It's always reforming, and it can become something much more than beautiful and integrated in the future, because it has this capacity to do so. And so I set out these overarching design principles here then that really involve focusing on the land, so focusing on soils, water, and air. And if we can get these three things right, if we can bring those three things back to health, then that sort of takes care of everything else. Because if we have healthy soils, if we have, healthy food to eat, healthy soils that plants can grow in, if we have fresh air to breathe, if we have fresh water to drink, then all of the other things just sort of fall into place. So we really need to be focusing on those three key elements. And I would say that not just in rural and wilderness environments, but also in urban environments.
Yeah.
That needs to be really highlighted. And then finally, the key moves I set out. So this is kind of like the design proposal, but in this case, it's kind of looking at policies, like everything from legislation to planning policies, to a landscape-led approach, to looking at how we kind of include these ideas in the education system, and skilling up so that we have a workforce that is capable of taking on restoration of the planet, basically. And then looking at what we as individuals can do daily, just sort of integrating habits into our own life that will help to bring about this transformation. So that's how the book is set out.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. I think what I really appreciate about it is that it's propositional. You didn't stop after the doom and gloom analysis in chapter 2. You sort of took, because that's a lot of the issue with, I think, environmental writing and communication. A lot of the time is we've been very good at discussing the problems, but not very good at proposing, responses to the problems. So that's I suppose the designer in you saying, right, we have the analysis. Now what do we do with it?
Well, that's right. Yeah. And so, I mean, that's the important part too, that I feel that as you say, we know we're just inundated with this doom and gloom message. And, it's true, and we need to be hearing it. But then we also, as you were saying, especially as people involved in the creative industries, need to be thinking about, well, then how do we change this? Because as we know, it's often the greatest challenges that create the biggest opportunities. So there's huge potential for change and to convert these terrible problems into huge opportunities, if only we could, sort of change our vision. So, while I know that my ideas, that this strategy I have put forward will definitely fall short, and, it's only the beginning, really. But I suppose I felt there's enough there to at least get going, and for people to see that there are definite and specific steps that can be taken to at least start moving us in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. Can you maybe just to sort of bring it to life for people, I suppose, because I think this sort of large landscape level of thinking is maybe a bit different to what many people listening might be used to, even in their own practice. They might be architects or planners listening who are used to working on a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any examples of what that might look like? Maybe case studies, or maybe just examples of the types of interventions that might
Yeah,
involve?
sure. Yeah. Well, actually, in the book, I do use a number of case studies because they are so helpful, aren't they, to really understanding what an idea is all about. And I suppose for me, one of the most important projects that I've been involved in is it was called the South Essex Green and Blue Infrastructure Study. So that was a project that my team and I began in 2019. So we were commissioned by the Association of South Essex Local Authorities. So they're a group of all the South Essex local authorities. So there's 6 of them, plus Essex County Council. And they realized that they needed to collaborate. They needed to come together to form a much larger and sort of grander collaborative framework to address so many challenges that they were facing in their region. So challenges to do with a lot of community deprivation. There's a lot of challenges with connectivity and transportation, huge amount of pollution. All of London's waste has gone into the South Essex
Oh,
region
wow.
recently, for decades. There's loads of landfills there, loads of industry. There's ports. There's threat of sea level rise all along that coastline. There's North Sea storm surges that are, with increasing severity. There's also pluvial flooding, so flooding throughout the region itself because of the rivers and the streams in there. They're also dealing with drought at the same time.
Wow. Yeah.
So apparently there's more drought there even than in Athens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. You never would think that, but this is true. And anyway, but at the same time, they have been earmarked and targeted to be a growth region by the federal government. So they need to produce a lot more housing and jobs. And so with all of these challenges that they were facing, they knew they needed something that would be overarching. And so, good on them for recognizing that. And so they were looking to pull together a spatial framework, and that included 5 key programs. So one was housing, one was transportation, there was digital, and anyway, and then green and blue infrastructure. They had identified it as another key program. So we were commissioned to do that study, and not recognizing really when we began just how important and exciting this project would be. Because when we started delving into the information and finding out all these things, at the beginning, I didn't know that they were faced with all these issues of sea level and, sea level rise, massive loss of important habitats is, all along there because of the bird life. And because it's the estuary, there's a huge amount of triple SIs, there's nature reserves, there's a lot of really important nature sites that are also under threat of being lost if sea level rise happens and there's nowhere for these habitats to shift to, because of development coming towards the water. If sea level rise happens, there's, the habitats can't move inland.
Okay,
So that's why there would be possibly huge losses. So all of these things we kind of learned along the way, and it was like, wow, we really need to do something that is big and bold and will really make meaningful change. And so as we started discovering all these things, and we did this through a lot of layering of information, so looking at geology and soils and habitats and, layering all this information and looking at it in relationship to each other. So seeing kind of where these key points of conflict are and where the key opportunity sites are. By doing that and then, speaking that through with the client team, we realized, okay, we need to do something really big here. So we need to set out a very comprehensive green and blue infrastructure that is much more than, integrating suds or something like that. This is looking at a robust regional framework. And so what we did there was set aside 30% of the land area for nature recovery. And that was actually before the nature recovery scheme came into place through the Environment Act. So it was really interesting because a lot of what we were doing there then aligned with what the Environment Act said we needed to do later on.
That's handy.
So we had, yeah. So putting in place. So what we did was we identified 5 major landscapes throughout the whole region. So the region is 70,000 hectares. And so we identified 24,000 hectares throughout that needed to be protected and managed very carefully. And so these include already existing parks, already existing nature reserves, but then also some agricultural lands that could have a lot of nature restoration involved. It also looked at industrial sites that could be rehabilitated, former industrial sites that could then be rehabilitated to become part of this major nature network. So in the end, we had a really robust structure that was then connected by another series of greenways and blueways that would connect across the whole region as well. So that strategy is available online if people want to take a look. It's all publicly available. And we've carried on with working on some of just looking at a demonstration project that is within Thurrock along the coastline there. So that is currently underway. And we're also going in for funding with the Thames Estuary Growth Board to hopefully get enough funding to deliver this, because it is a big thing, but it's right in line with, as I said, with what the government is looking to do with nature recovery. So
absolutely. And I think, this sort of strategic level planning needs to be happening all across the country, really, and is really missing, I feel, in the UK.
Yes.
As you were doing this sort of landscape strategy, was it also tying in with areas for housing growth and new towns and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So part of this, I think what you said just before that too, about how the UK is missing these kind of regional strategies. I think that became more and more clear to me as we went through this process. And it was another reason why I wanted to write this book, was because what became so clear is that in the UK, and then also in many countries around the world, there isn't this kind of level of regional landscape thinking going on. And yet it's at that regional level and at that, at a watershed level, for instance, where we need to be thinking about land, but typically it is not considered. So, we're typically looking at things on a plot by plot basis. And of course, nature doesn't care about plot boundaries. Water will flow where it flows. It doesn't care if there's a boundary line shown on a map. So we really need to be considering things at a much larger scale, and then putting in place these strategies and having it integrated into our policies. It can then be adopted by local plans. So yes, I think. Oh, now I'm forgetting the second part of your question. Can you remind me of that?
About how it integrated with the new areas for housing?
Oh, yes. So that's another wonderful thing that it can do. So if you have a landscape strategy that sets out all of the most sensitive areas of landscape, so that will also set out for you areas that should not be developed, and then areas that are much more appropriate for development. So, for example, we shouldn't really be developing any of our wetlands or marshes.
Yeah.
Those should not be converted to farmlands or to housing or to industry. We have such a lack of wetlands globally now. And also because of flooding and sea level rise, these areas will probably be inundated soon with water, leading to then massive risk to property and to lives in those areas. So if you have a landscape strategy that already shows you what areas need protection, then it also makes very clear what areas are appropriate for development. And so it
Yeah.
shows how the two can work in a very complementary way, one supporting the other. So, the nature areas then kind of bringing health and well-being and protection even to those areas of development. So yeah, in the South Essex plan, then we were able to show how development then can then be very sensitively
Mm.
and beautifully kind of integrated into this much larger network of nature spaces.
Yeah, fantastic. I think on the policy and more legislation side of things, just we've mentioned the Environment Act and Biodiversity Net Gain and that kind of thing, and I think this is very interesting. You have to give props to the UK for being, I think the first country in the world to put forward a legislation like this that mandates that new development must provide 10% biodiversity net gain as a minimum.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested to know from your, now obviously in principle, this is a really great thing.
Yes. Yeah.
I'd be interested to know, in your practice, how are you finding this working in reality?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for bringing BNG up. I think it's a really important subject. And, I've been listening to Professor David Hill quite a lot because he's the person that brought this idea to the fore, I think at least a couple of decades ago, and has been working to get it into policy for, the last couple of decades. And now it finally has. But the idea for biodiversity net gain, the way it's being implemented now is mostly on site, so within a particular development plot. And there's opportunity for doing some biodiversity net gain offsite, but this currently isn't happening very often. So this is what we're already seeing, because there were a number of projects that were undertaken that incorporated biodiversity net gain, even sort of ahead of the legislation. So some of the early adopters, some of the developers or local authorities that adopted these ideas early. And so we can see the outcome of some of this. And what it's showing us is that, biodiversity net gain is typically happening within a plot. And so what the outcome there is are kind of really intense ecologically focused areas, but also areas that have a lot of human activity involved in them.
Yeah.
So they're sort of under high stress, I would say. And then if the developer leaves and is no longer maintaining that area, then within 5 years, those biodiversity net gain benefits are depleted.
Right.
So, a key component of this legislation is that the biodiversity be maintained and managed for a period of 30 years. But currently, there's not, most local authorities don't have that kind of funding and the sort of resources available, or even maybe the skill base to carry that out.
Yeah.
So,
and to enforce it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no, there's typically not enforcement happening. That's what is becoming quite obvious. And so then the benefits are quickly fall away.
Yeah.
And it's really in the offsite. So I think even David Hill would say that was where the real benefits were seen to be possible. Would be if then, for example, a developer didn't have space within their own plot to bring about those benefits, that they would then be funded in another site, for example, at a local nature reserve, to extend that area and to create kind of larger networks and connections of biodiversity and habitats to support biodiversity. So that is really where I think it needs to be going. Again, if we had these regional landscape strategies, it would be so much easier then for local government to know exactly where these BNG credits should go. It would provide them a plan and direction. At the moment, it's happening a little bit haphazardly. Another thing that is happening is that habitats that are easier to create are being those are the ones that are being prioritized. So, for example, grasslands, or, species-rich grasslands or something like that. While really important, they may not always be appropriate, or they're also the ones that tend to get more funding because they're easier to deliver. Whereas something like a wetland might not be as easy to deliver, that is, really required, but we're not seeing so many of those being developed. So that's another issue that's happening. I mean, there's quite a number of issues, I think, that are coming to the fore and that aren't really surprising considering, as I said, nature isn't bound by plots. And so to try and squeeze in benefits within defined boundaries is very, very difficult.
Yeah. And I think it has to be said that, as much development may be happening in the UK, that, doing that biodiversity net gain on development sites alone is not what's going to be the bounce back for nature, in Britain. And there has to be that wider landscape perspective. Something I'm perhaps hopeful of is part of the legislation as well, is that every county in England has to put together a nature recovery strategy for the county. And so that is sort of now taking a landscape scale perspective on it. And hopefully that means local authorities and figuring out how new development fits in with the wider landscape and the wider biodiversity recovery strategy, as part of that. So we'll have to see. They're all under formulation at the moment. So we'll have to just keep our fingers crossed and hope they work well.
I think you're right, and I think even though there are some issues with biodiversity net gain, it's just wonderful that there is this focus on it now, and that there is at least a starting point. So, and as you say, now with these nature recovery strategies coming into play, that again will raise the bar to another level. There's also the environmental land management schemes, so integrating nature conservation within agricultural lands as well. That's another aspect of the Environment Act, and which is incredibly important because within the UK alone, about 70% of the land is agricultural. And so if you imagine that 70% of that of the UK, if that 70% were then working to support local wildlife and to improve nature conservation, as well as being productive in terms of food production. And actually the two tend to work very well in relation to each other. If you have a healthy functioning ecosystem within a farmland, that farm tends to be much more productive because then all the systems, the water, the soils, everything is more healthy and thriving. So that's something too. But from what I understand, that there's loads of farmers now that are interested in that kind of approach. But what is very difficult is transitioning from sort of the industrial agriculture where we see, a lot of intensive use, fertilizers, pesticides, monocultures, and then trying to transition from that into more regenerative farming can be very costly for these farmers. Even if they want to do it, they might not have the means to do so. And that funding still isn't really very available from the government. There's funding once you are in that place, to support these management schemes, these land management schemes. But that transition, I think, is what is very difficult. So again, that hopefully will be something that comes to the fore and, is brought to light as the Environment Act legislation really is kind of played out. But I guess that will take some time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'd be interested to think about urban environments a little bit more and how some of this thinking applies, in cities, for instance.
Yeah, well, going back to what I mentioned earlier about thinking about soils, water, and air, and I think so oftentimes, especially soil, we talk all the time about soils in farmlands or maybe in wilderness areas, but most people, I think, forget that there's even soil in cities. Typically, we're so disconnected from the soil in a city. If you consider a typical street with buildings lining it, most of the time, there's no exposed soil. It's just, building line, pavement, and then, crossing the road, more pavement, curb, more pavement, building. And if you're lucky, you might get a little hole for a tree to try and struggle to survive
Yeah.
in. And even then, you don't really see much soil. So, I think the condition of soils in urban areas is even worse. When in the
Yeah.
built environment, soils are just scoured away. This wonderful topsoil that exists is removed. Any soil that does remain is typically just paved over. And so we don't have this connection to the land. And I think that's quite tragic. And there's been quite a lot of focus in recent years on integrating sustainable urban drainage systems into our streetscapes, for example. And that is a big move forward. But I think along with that, we need to be also prioritizing soil. So, for example, when I started working in Vancouver, this was like 25 years ago, I worked for the Greenways department here. And it was a super innovative department. And I didn't realize at that time, because I was just brand new out of university. It was my first job. I had no idea how innovative this was because it was everything I'd been learning in university. And then when I went to work, what we were doing was designing and implementing green routes through the city. So for pedestrians and cyclists. And so we were incorporating all of these great sustainable and innovative strategies. So, for example, narrowing pavements so that we could increase permeability on the street, integrating local planting, utilizing sustainable urban drainage and swales to allow, stormwater to flow off into these areas and naturally filter. So we were doing all of these things, and actually it was shown to not be any more expensive than to design a street in the typical way with just loads of paving. And I want to tell you about this example in particular because it just highlights the importance of just redesigning one street. So this one in Vancouver, it was housing on one side, and then the other side was a park. And so it was a group of us. So it was landscape architects, engineers, planners, and the local community working together to design this street. And as I said, we did all of those things. And at the end of the street was a stream that had been culverted, I think, a number of decades ago. And it was actually exposed on either side of this culvert, but the culvert went below the road. And so that culvert was actually revised a little bit too. So it was made larger and made a little bit more habitable, I would say, for stream life. But then also in combination with the changes that were made to the street, because no longer did you have all of the stormwater rushing into the storm drain and then piped into the stream and then just, exiting the pipe in a big gush that scours the stream bed. Rather, you had the water going into these swales, and then at the end of the road, there was an attenuation basin where the water could then settle and filter slowly and then enter the stream slowly in a purified way as well. And because of these changes, the next year salmon were found in the stream.
Oh, wow.
Again. Just like
so
that.
Quickly.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So, just immediately the salmon knew that it was a safe place for them to traverse again and to spawn.
Incredible.
So, so these changes do make huge differences. And I think it's important for people to know that, because so often I think even as designers, we can think, oh, well, it's, maybe it's not that important if it's going to be difficult because there's a utility in the way or whatever. And so maybe it's easy to give up sometimes. But actually, these are things that can have massive impacts environmentally. And especially when you think of that, if that was just one street, if that was done everywhere throughout the city, the change that could happen is enormous. So, I'm really for, that talk about utilities, trenching utilities rather than trenching the trees, for example.
Right.
So I think
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
got it backwards. We put, even the terminology we use, tree pits. Like, well,
Yeah.
why would we put a tree in a pit? It's awful. Trees are these glorious, magnificent life forms, and here we have
Yeah.
them stuck in these tiny little holes in the ground with
Yeah.
barricades all around them. Really, we should have the utilities in a trench, and that can be done, and we do it on our projects wherever we can. So we put the utilities in a trench, and they have to be coordinated, and then you open up loads of space to have
Oh,
healthy
wow.
soils, linear strips of trees and other planting. Then you can have the water flowing into the ground, and suddenly, just by making this small change, again, it's like a shift in perspective. No, we don't need to be trenching the trees. We need to be trenching the utilities. And then suddenly the whole approach to a street can change, and so many more opportunities come about.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, we haven't even mentioned like all the benefits to humans of doing that in terms of,
Yeah,
the urban heat island mitigation and reducing flooding and all that stuff. Like it's very much in our interest to be doing these things as well.
exactly. I mean, the amount of people I know in London that have had their flats flooded or something
Oh, yeah.
recently, well, that could have been overcome if only we had had these areas for water to go. But
Mm,
there's just nowhere for water to go most of the time.
yeah.
Except for into a little hole, and then if that hole gets plugged, then you know
Yeah, and I think we often, when there is, like, let's say, sustainable drainage interventions put in, I feel like they're done quite opportunistically. So maybe there's some funding from a development, so it happens on this street, but there isn't always the landscape level thinking of actually where is the most important places to put it, so that we're getting the water flows right and all that kind of stuff.
Well, that's right. It needs to be considered strategically, and it also needs to become the norm. That isn't sort of the special case. This is just the
Yeah.
normal case. And then another key element I would mention that is very difficult for designers to control, but it's something that our clients can really think about more, and that is coordinating utilities. So at the moment,
Mm,
because we have in the UK, different water companies, then you've got, for example, someone else dealing with fiber optics, and these are all privately owned
yeah.
companies. So they're all coming in, digging up the road, and sort of destroying things that then need to be repaired constantly. So there's no coordination. But in many cities around the world, those utilities are coordinated. So for example, in Vancouver, where I was mentioning, before we would go in and design a greenway and have that implemented, there would be a whole coordination sort of program that would go into place. So everything, all the piping and everything that needed to happen, anything that needed updating or improving, happened in the couple of years before the implementation of the new greenway. And so there wasn't so much waste, and there wasn't destruction of the new streetscape and that sort of thing. I guess I'm focusing on streets too, because they actually are about 25% of most urban land area. And
Right.
so if you just imagine that 25% of cities could be transformed, that is a massive impact.
Yeah.
That doesn't include the parks and gardens and public plazas. And, that's just the streets. So that could have a massive, significant impact.
Yeah.
If we were
Totally
just
agree.
to really focus on streets.
We're coming towards the end of our time here, and I could keep chatting to you for hours, but we'll try and wrap it up in the next 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
Would you have any sort of final advice for built environment practitioners, particularly who are listening to this, on sort of how they can take these ideas and start creating positive change?
Yeah, well, I suppose for anybody working in the built environment, I would say, do always keep in mind that broader community of life. Sometimes I like to say, well, how often do we think of urban design from the perspective of a different life form? We're always thinking about urban design from our own perspective, from a human perspective, and that is very important. I mean, typically, in the past it was from a vehicle's perspective.
Right.
now it's more about a people-oriented approach typically. But I would like to extend that out even further and say, okay, well, what is it like for the soil? What's it like for the water? What's this urban design like for the air? What's it like for the local wildlife? What's it like for that bird in the sky? Can we design something that is meeting the needs of all of these life forms? And we can do that. So I guess that's something I would like people to always be thinking about. What's it like from another life form's perspective? To always have that kind of in the back of your mind. And then to focus on those 3 key elements of soil, water, and air, and just thinking about everything that you're doing in terms of those 3 elements. Is this working? What can I do to preserve the soils? In this construction project, we're going to be stripping all this topsoil away, for example. Well, is there something else we can do? Can we somehow preserve it? Can we reuse it? Can it be stored in a certain way that maintains its vitality? How do we work with the water in this area and thinking about that larger watershed? Which areas should we avoid? Which areas need to be protected? And just to have in mind all of these connections to the land itself and the foundation of development, and how we can bring about the health of that foundation, that to really improve the long-term health of the development itself too.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's great. That's a great point to end on. And I'll have links to your book and your website in the episode description. But if you'd like to point people towards anything, you can let them know.
All right. Well, so our company's website is alexandrasteedurban.com. And the book, again, is Portrait to Landscape. It's available on Amazon and on many audio platforms as well.
Great. Amazing. Okay, thank you so much. We'll close it up there.
Thank you.